This would carry over into some of the missionary strategies used by the Franciscans. Two major ones that were important was the development of encomienda. Essentially, encomienda was a legal system for the colonization of North America. And so the idea was, first of all, we'll bring Spanish people to North America. If you can get people there, then it's under your control, and the Pope will have to give you, will have to recognize that this is Spanish land. And so get the people over there. Secondly, the other purpose was supposedly to convert Native Americans. So tracts of land were to be given to the Spanish settlers. And so if you're willing to come over, you get these huge pieces of land. And if you're going to take the land, you get the labor of all the Native Americans who lived on that land. So essentially, they're kind of forced into servitude. However, in order to receive that, you had to promise that you would instruct Native Americans in the Catholic faith. Then you would be entitled to their forced labor. And so you have this system of slave labor with the religious rationale added to it. It appears that there was very little religious instruction that actually took place. Instead, it was more about forced conversions, brutality, and slavery. For example, starting in 1502, the mission that started in Hispaniola, which was approved by the crown in 1503, made several people very rich. By 1542, however, encomienda legally ended when it was recognized what was happening. The system was so embedded, though, that it was almost impossible to root out and colored all the contact between Europeans and Native Americans. There were missionaries who participated in the encomienda system, and there were also those who were against it. So you have, again, this kind of combination of conquest and evangelizing. Holding a Spanish mass, for example, at the end of a battle, or once you conquer specific lands. So on the one side, there was encomienda. On the other side was the mission system, essentially setting up these Spanish towns in North America and South America. There were differences between the missions and encomienda. The missions sought to bring Native Americans to a specific place instead of taking over the lands that they were on. And the purpose of the missions largely was to make the natives Spanish. So the cities were set up, the missions were set up in European styles, the town squares, the villages looked like Spain. So the Franciscans and the Jesuits as well, coming from Spain, did not have any interest in learning native languages. They wanted to make the Native Americans Spanish. So you import Spanish culture, you import the Spanish language. So Native Americans would be forced to wear European dress, eat European food, and speak in European languages. With the missions, there were a couple of strategies that the Franciscans employed. First was the attempt to turn the native world upside down, to stabilize it socially. For example, in the Southwest, for the Pueblo, the world was conceptualized between the center and the periphery. And this is how the mind was set up. And there's the center of the world, and then there's the outside. And so, as the Pueblos set up their villages, at the center were things that were holy, that were native. That's where the elders would be, because they would be the most respected. And in the center, people engaged in gift-giving and respect, right, reciprocity. And it would be the people with spiritual status that would live in the center. Outside were the unholy. That's where the young stayed. That's where the foreign was. It was out in the periphery where force was used to protect the center. Violence occurred. And so those who used force and violence, although necessary, the hunters and the warriors, lived on the outsides, or lived in the periphery of society. Ultimately, though, there was a series of obligations that everyone had to each other. It was about balance and distinctiveness. The missions turned all of this on its head, so that mission churches would often be built on shrines that Native Americans had. So putting a church right where the holiest part of the Pueblo was. Furthermore, there was an inversion of this old-young dichotomy, where the Pueblo world had emphasized the importance of the elders. For the Franciscans, a lot of the emphasis was on youth. And so, the Franciscans tended to humiliate elderly Native Americans and elevated the young beyond their station in Native life, giving them gifts, right, which would put them in obligation to the Franciscans. When they would develop some of these miracle plays, or the morality plays that we talked about at the end of the Middle Ages, the end of the last section of Middle Ages, the young would play the angelic characters, and the demonic characters would be given to the old. Again, trying to destabilize this notion of reciprocity and obligation. The missions also tended to be heavily visual as opposed to oral or written. The Franciscans, again, are not interested in learning native languages, and so in order to express Catholicism, they turn to material objects, ceremonies, as opposed to theological instruction. And so it was communicating Catholic ideas through statues, through other types of objects, the practice of the Eucharist, expressing things in symbols, crosses, baptism, symbols of the Virgin Mary. All of these were very important in communicating to Native Americans. And as they did so, of course, the theology couldn't be that complicated because you're trying to express it in symbols. For example, how would you try to express the ontological proof for the existence of God in such a way when you don't? I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to express when you share the same language with someone, let alone to try and cross a language barrier and explain a concept that is foreign to most Christians, let alone to non-Christians. So the theology tended to be very simple. Things like reality of heaven and hell, the afterlife, punishment and reward, passion plays, proceeding through town with objects. But there was also a concern that the native tribes were demonic and idolatrous, as you could understand, right? There might be some worship of gods, but there also would be the ancestors, spirit beings. Right? There would be differences among native tribes. But ultimately, though, a lot of the Franciscans and other Christians believed that the devil had a hold on Native Americans. But with this, there were some people, and there was some controversy over how should Europeans relate to Native Americans, and how do you understand Native Americans and the status that Native Americans had. In the midst of all this, we can see a separation between a variety of missionaries over in the New World. Some we'll be talking about here: Bartolomé de las Casas, we'll talk about the most, Juan de Sepúlveda, Francisco Ruiz, and Jacobo de Testera. A debate between two groups over the status of Native Americans. De las Casas was the son of a conquistador who was also a merchant. Born in 1474, his father had accompanied Columbus as a common soldier. And in participating in that mission, he got wealthy enough where he could send his son to a good school. And so Bartolome, grown up, good education, studied law, comes to Cuba in 1502, sees the birth of Encomienda, also decides to take the life of the priest. So he becomes a Dominican in 1511 and is going to be a priest in the colonies. He's actually made the chaplain of Cuba. But as he sees how the Spanish are interacting with the natives, he becomes concerned. At one point, he sees a native chief who's been captured in rebellion and sentenced to be burned alive. Las Casas thinks, well, this shouldn't be. He tries to have his life spared, believing that maybe the chief will convert. So the chief is given a chance to convert. He responds that he will not, and so he dies. This interaction made a deep impact on De Las Casas. And so he writes a document called A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies that is sent back to Europe. Essentially a graphic account of what the conquistadors were doing to the natives in the colonies. And he will become a central figure in this debate over Native Americans. Essentially, once Europeans traveled to the Americas and interacted with natives, they were interacting with, for them, a new people that they had never heard of before. And so the questions began to arise. What do you do about these people? How do you understand them? Questions like, do Native Americans have the capacity for faith? De Las Casas, the Testera, said, yes, they have the possibility, they have the capacity to have faith. They are human. Sepulveda and Ruiz, on the other hand, said, no, they do not have the capacity. Are Native Americans even human? Was another question that was debated. Las Casas, the Testera, said, yes. Ruiz and Sepulveda said, no. And out of this, should Native Americans be enslaved? And as you might expect, De Las Casas, the Testera, said no. Sepulveda, Ruiz said yes, they should be. Ruiz was a Franciscan. He argued against Native American humanity. Said they were not capable of natural judgment. It wasn't possible for them to receive faith. They were something less than human. Sepulveda, on the other hand, was a classics scholar and sees Native Americans through Aristotelian philosophy of the natural slave, believing them to be of deficient intellect because they did not have a written language. They did not seem to understand European ways, so they must be deficient intellectually, and so they are born to be slaves. They could not master their passions, he argued. The passions ruled over the intellect. They were mentally defective. They needed to be enslaved for their own good. It was the church's duty to do this. Las Casas, on the other hand, of course, the Native Americans, to him, seemed to be closer to God's ideal. They seemed to be pure. They didn't have the church corruption, for example. They seemed to be obedient and humble and patient, especially those that were interested in conversion. They were, in his word, gentle sheep. The Testera, on the other hand, Franciscan, said the Native Americans had impressive buildings. They exhibited very subtle creations. They were courteous. They composed music. And so there were a lot of things that evidenced humanity for those two, where the others are the opposite. But essentially, colonists, conquistadors had other ideas. We know better than the Native Americans. And so they are children. Eventually, though, the Pope is called upon to respond to this. And so Paul III releases a papal document known as Sublimis Deus in the year 1531. In the document, Paul claims that Native Americans have a capacity for faith, and so he decides that they were causes. They are human, and therefore they should not and cannot be enslaved. Now this will have some effect on encomienda, but it did not bring it to an end. It does, however, give the priests in the area some ability to censure conquistadors who were acting in ways that were inappropriate with the church's teaching. Eventually, though, the Spanish model will move from encomienda and force to belief in persuasion, but of course, when you have a sizable military force there with you, can we say it's truly persuasion?